Welcome to Perspectives Matter. I'm Jim Falk, and today we're talking about a topic very much on our minds. That's climate change. The majority of reports from COP26, the recently concluded Glasgow summit, carried a dark message that climate change is the greatest risk facing the globe and humanity. Yet, apart from the summit, there are different views, and these views do deserve our attention. You'll hear today from an acknowledged expert in the field, who, let me stress, he's not a climate denier, but he does believe this, that the science on climate change is unsettled.
Hello, I'm Jim Cathcart, and I have the pleasure of introducing our guest today. Dr. Stephen Koonin is a professor of theoretical physics at New York University, former vice president and provost at Caltech, and former Obama administration Undersecretary for Science in the U.S. Department of Energy. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences and a respected leader in science policy in the United States with a long record of advising on science, national security, energy, and climate matters. He is the author of the Wall Street Journal best-selling book, Unsettled: What Climate Science Tells Us, What It Doesn't, and Why It Matters. Dr. Coonan, welcome to the show. And I'd like to pose the most obvious question. Unsettled? I thought the climate science was settled.
You know, some things about climate science are settled. The globe has warmed by about 1.1 degrees Celsius since 1900. Carbon dioxide is accumulating in the atmosphere, almost entirely due to human activities. It exerts a warming influence on the globe. But exactly how much the globe will warm and what the impacts of that warming will be on extreme weather, on ecosystems, on society as a whole is very much unsettled.
You would never hear what you said in the way that you said it.
You know, the information about climate science, what the climate is doing, goes through a long game of telephone before it gets to the general public. It starts from the scientific reports and the basic data. It goes through an assessment process run periodically by the United Nations and the US government. The UN just put out in August its most recent assessment report. It then goes to the summaries of those assessment reports that are meant for policymakers, and then on to the media through press releases, and then on to the politicians. And in that long game of telephone, there are ample opportunities and motives to spin the message. And when you compare what comes out at the end with what started at the beginning, you can see it's not a very faithful representation of what's going on.
And I suspect that editors of newspapers or assignment editors at the television stations really are not very comfortable presenting a view that is not in the highlights of these assessments.
Absolutely. You know, as you know, if you're in journalism, if it bleeds, it leads. And a story that says there's not much happening with hurricanes over the last century is not going to get you on the front page or get anybody's attention.
I was traveling yesterday and I noticed signs everywhere that seem to all draw the same conclusion, that extreme weather events are increasing, that the Earth is in terrible danger of humans existing on it, and that we really need to do something drastic. How do you respond to that?
You know, if you look at the data, and you've got to look at the weather data over many decades, because climate is a 30-year average. It's not what happened last year or even the last few years, but it's what happens over 30-year periods. And when you do that, there are some things that are changing. As I mentioned, the globe is getting warmer, and of course, heat waves are getting warmer, more common. But and actually, intense precipitation over land is becoming a little more common. But many other things, hurricanes, mid-latitude storms, extreme winds, floods, many kinds of drought, one can go on, show no variation beyond natural variability.
I lived in California and experienced wildfires, you know, up close and personal. And I know a lot of people are using that as the example. A lot of our viewers has commented on that as an example of the extreme urgency of doing something radical to alter the climate?
Well, I lived in California for 30 years in the South, so I know the scene a bit as well. And like many of these issues, fires are complicated. And let me just tell you some facts. If you go back to the 1920s, the acreage burned every year in the US was about 5 or 6 times what it is today. And then it fell dramatically to 1970, even as the country warmed. And since 1970, it's gone up modestly. The reason for that fall has got nothing to do with the climate, but it's got everything to do with the Forest Service, which started a deliberate strategy of fire exclusion. And that allowed the forest to grow. What could be bad about that? Smokey the Bear, we all remember that, because it allowed the fuel for forest fires to accumulate over the last almost a century. And so when conditions do become conducive to fires, as they have in California over the last 30 years, you get disasters, particularly when people put towns like Paradise, California, in the middle of the forests. So California has become drier over the last 30 years, but we have seen comparable dry periods over the last couple thousand years that we know from tree ring data. The question of how much human influences are contributing to the current drought is, I would say, very much unsettled.
And then isn't one of the issues too that reporting has changed so much, I would say improved, that we have a lot more data, current data today than we would have had 20, 50, 100 years ago?
We have a lot of data about the climate system and its impacts, and that's wonderful for those who are studying the problem. On the other hand, it's also grist for the media, since there's always some extreme event happening somewhere that you can point to and say, aha, it's that CO2 stuff.
In your book, Unsettled, you make a very strong distinction between climate and weather. And I think the popular view is that they're the same. How do you separate those two?
They're very different. You know, the old saying is that climate is what you expect, but weather is what you get. And again, the official definition by the World Meteorological Organization is that climate is a 30-year average of weather and its variability. And so we tend to forget. I'll give you a good example. In the mid-50s, there was a significant drought in the Midwest. And one of the news magazines, I think it was Time, said, people will long remember this drought. And of course, a year or two later, it was completely forgotten. And so we tend to get absorbed in the present. And if you're studying climate, you really have to take this long time and large spatial scale view of the problem.
Steve, I'd like you to talk a little bit about what was such a focal point at the Glasgow summit, and that was reduction of carbon emissions. Is it wrong that we're trying to do that?
You know, carbon emissions are warming the planet or exerting a warming influence on the planet. They do have some good as well. They've increased the vegetation on the Earth by about 30% over the last 40 years. Plants love CO2. We put it into greenhouses, and so you would expect in the natural world it will help plants grow. I think it is a good idea to try to moderate human influences on the climate by reducing CO2 emissions, but one has to be realistic about the prospects for being able to do that, and also what the impacts would be if we could reduce emissions. And so I'm happy to go into both of those in a little more detail.
Yeah, I'd like you to talk about the impact.
So let's talk about the impact first. The basic science hurdle we need to deal with is that carbon dioxide lives in the atmosphere for centuries. Once we put it up there, about half of it stays in the atmosphere. Once we put it up there, it's there for a long time. And so if we reduce emissions, we will simply reduce the rate at which the amount is growing, but we won't stop it from growing. If you want to stabilize the amount, prevent it from growing, and hopefully eventually see it reduced, we've got to go to zero emissions. And the UN says if you want the temperature to go up no more than 1.5 degrees from what it was before Industrial Revolution, we need to go to zero by 2050 globally. Whereas if we want to go up by 2 degrees, we need to go to zero by 2070. So that's part of the challenge in doing it. Then there are the societal challenges in doing that. Right now, those of us in the developed world, there are about 1 billion, 1.2 billion of us in the US, EU, Japan, Australia, and so on. We have a pretty high consumption of energy, and our lives are much better for it. But there are 6 billion people in the world who are still improving their standard of living. Some of them start from pretty far down. And as they improve their standard of living, they need energy to do that. And right now, the most convenient and reliable way of getting that energy is with fossil fuels. And in fact, 80% of the world gets its energy right now from fossil fuels. And so you have this tension between wanting to provide energy to people who really need it, and that's a moral issue, I would say, and at the same time wanting to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. That's the tension that's going on in Glasgow right now. It's the same tension that was there in Paris, and it's been there almost from the beginning.
And it seems that the collective, the momentum is toward renewables in almost every instance. Yet we had, under the COVID shutdown, which was a global event, not just local, obviously, a radical reduction in human activity and output with negligible effect, right?
Yeah, greenhouse gas emissions, I think, went down about 8% for the year and then rebounded. I mean, when people have economic activity, whether it's development or just ordinary economic growth in our country, for example, energy use goes up. And if you're getting your energy from fossil fuels, emissions are going to go up.
So the targets that came out of Glasgow were very aggressive. I don't think they had a lot of teeth to them. But what is the economic cost of some of the measures that have been recommended, as well as the cost of global warming and climate change?
You know, you obviously want to balance the two of those one against the other to decide, at least on an economic basis, what you want to do. And let's talk about the cost of global warming first, and then we can talk about the cost of trying to reduce emissions. The IPCC reports and the US government reports say that a warming of as much as 6 degrees above pre-industrial, remember Paris is shooting for 2, would have about a 4 or 5% impact on the US or global economy in 2100. In other words, that's about 3 or 4 years worth of growth. We should look at that picture. It's right there out of the report. And so, you know, you would argue that's not a very big economic impact. And then the question is, how much should we spend in order to avoid that economic impact? And in fact, you know, the reports say that there are many other factors beyond climate that influence economic activity: regulation, technology, demographics, trade, and so on. And so I like to say this is a problem, but this is by no means a crisis, and we've got time to deal with it. So let's talk about then the cost of doing it. And of course, the administration has put out some plans. The general strategy, not only this administration, but other countries as well, is to turn transportation, the cars that we drive and the light trucks, into electric vehicles. And we're making good progress on the technology for that. It's still more expensive to have an electric car. There are some inconveniences, but there are also advantages. And then once you've eliminated gasoline or diesel from the picture, then you need to clean up the grid. And the fossil fuels that are used to power the grid, mostly gas in the US now, although still some coal, and the CO2 that it emits. The strategy so far has been wind and solar. But in fact, that's entirely unsatisfactory. The wind and solar are intermittent generators. That means that they produce electricity when the wind blows or when the sun shines. But we need electricity reliably around the clock. And that means you need some kind of backup, whether it's nuclear power or big batteries or other ways of storing electricity. Those need to be there as well. And the biggest cost of all renewable grid is not the wind and solar, but 4 or 5 times more expensive is assuring that reliability, that it be there 99.99% of the time.
We have could do, should do, will do from your book. I like that structure. What is it? How do we think about this and about what to do in light of all this?
Yeah, I think because energy permeates every aspect of society, trying to change the energy system is a difficult task. Mm-hmm. We need to come up with thoughtful plans that integrate technology development, small reactors, batteries, and so on. Together with the economics, we need to make it possible that people can still make money providing this. With the regulation that modulates the economics, and then with consumer behavior and preferences. Some people don't like electric cars, some people don't nuclear power, and so on. No one has put together such an integrated plan.
Steve, how do we walk back from the highly politicization of this issue? I know how when your book, Unsettled, came out several months ago, you really suffered some pretty personal attacks from the review that was in the Wall Street Journal, and then there was quite a campaign against that review. How do we get back to just the analysis of the science, and that policymakers are not using it as a way to generate more campaign funds?
Right. The attacks on me and what I've written are particularly amusing, because virtually everything in the book is right out of the reports. It's just that nobody ever reads the reports. They're just at the end of this long game of telephone. I think that what's needed right now is for the scientific societies, the professional societies, the national academies, the UK Royal Society, to say, there is no climate crisis. This is a problem. We need to deal with it, but the urgency and scope that the politicians are responding with is not necessary and will be more disruptive than any climate change one can imagine. That's going to be really hard for the politicians to swallow, because, for example, President Biden a few days ago said, we have turned the climate crisis into an opportunity. And it's right there in the press release.
But Steve, is there support in the academies and in the scientific community?
In parts of the academy, there is. I wrote the book in part to educate my fellow scientists who are not in the climate business about the kind of misrepresentation and distortion that goes on as we try to talk to the public. And even if there isn't enough support, if the kind of plans that the administration has put out actually come to pass, there's going to be popular pushback. People are going to say, tell me again why we're doing this. I think that will have political implications and unfortunately could set back the whole business by a decade or two. We've already seen that kind of thing in France with the yellow vests, and in the UK, where they tried to make everybody put heat pumps in their houses instead of gas, and there was just a popular revolt.
Yeah, I've noticed that the tendency of people who are debating this is to quote all the charts and graphs, and the charts and graphs that show these huge spikes and get people alarmed. And as I read your book, you have many of those charts and graphs, but wow, the conclusions you have reached by studying them are profoundly different than the alarmist point of view. How did help us
again,
understand?
I tried to take everything out of the reports. And what happens is, as the information comes to the public, you'll excuse me, the journalists and the activists and the politicians all get to spin the story. And so you hear about, sea levels flooding the coast, when in fact it's been going up at a foot a century. Okay? Or you hear about increasingly stronger storms, but storms were just as strong 5 decades ago. So
not as many people were living on the coast then.
And of course, so the damage is more, and we didn't have the kind of 24/7 media coverage that we've got that just amps up everything. Let me give you an example of how the politicians amp it up. When the most recent UN report was released on August 9th, the Secretary General of the UN, Guterres, said, "Code red for humanity. Billions of people at immediate risk." Well, if you search all 3,949 pages of the report, you can't find the phrase existential threat or climate disaster or climate catastrophe anywhere in the report. You do find the phrase climate crisis exactly once, and it's used not as a scientific finding, but as a statement of how the US media have amped up the coverage.
Steve, I think the obvious answer you might, when I ask this question, will be that everyone should read your book. But where can our viewers find information other than reading 4,000 pages of the IPCC?
Right, and of course reading my book. But one of the reasons I wrote the book is that there is this vacuum of inability of people to see around the communication chain and what's actually in the reports. I think the best strategy is to become curious. Somebody said, well, we've seen record rainfalls in New York City, right, in August 21. That was a record 1 hour rainfall. Well, we've got records that go back in New York City 150 years. And let's have a look at the record. You can find it on the web. The New York Times published a record. And it turns out, at least if you look at daily rainfall, it's kind of hard to get 1 hour rainfalls too far back, that the most recent event on September 1st in New York City was only the 5th rainiest day ever in New York City history. And the rainiest day was in 1879. So a little bit of curiosity, that's what I try to imbue in my students that I teach here at NYU. Don't take anybody's word for it. Go look it up yourself, which is a great strategy for anybody interested in science.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. I want to ask, is there anything that we haven't probed and explored that you would like to share? And with that, I'd like you to comment on the difference in terminology, changing climate, climate change.
I think that's an interesting distinction to make to people. I try to make it in the book. Climate change, as defined by the UN and has come into popular use, is a change in climate due to human influences, greenhouse gases mostly. I like to use the phrase a changing climate because we know from historical records that the climate does a pretty good job of changing all by itself. And so when people say, let's fight climate change, I'm kind of amused because the climate's going to keep changing whether we reduce greenhouse gas emissions or not.
Climate stasis. But if the climate didn't change, we'd all die, wouldn't we?
Absolutely. And it's going to change anyway. It's such a complicated system driven by the sunlight with the atmosphere, the oceans. It's been changing for as long as we can study it. But the real question is whether the recent changes, as human influences have grown since about 1950, is whether they're unusual or not.
Steve, one thing we like to do on the program is give all of us, our viewers and us, solutions. And adaptation seems like something that we should put more emphasis on. Is that correct? And what are the steps we should take?
I think the prospects for the world reducing its emissions sufficiently to make a difference in the next 50 or 60 years is pretty slim for reasons I talked about. And then when you look at the options, I think we're going to adapt. And, as the globe warmed since 1900 to today by about 1 or 1.1 degrees, the population quadrupled, and we saw the greatest improvement in human well-being ever in history. That says we're perfectly capable of dealing with or even exploiting changes that happen at about a degree a century.
Steve, we unfortunately have run out of time. I certainly like your backdrop. No global warming there, I don't think.
No, just greening,
That's right. But thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to be with us. And thanks all of you for watching. This will not be our last program, nor has it been our first program on climate change. It's such a controversial and important issue for us to, I think, fair to say, reach beyond the headlines. And that's what we like to do here on the McQuiston program, where we are always talking about things that matter with people who care. Thanks again for watching.